We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Last week we learned that Nova Scotians will have significantly less access to legalized cannabis than they were promised. NSLC admitted that because of production delays, Nova Scotians should, and I quote, expect less than what we ordered, end of quote, with inventory shortages becoming the norm after legalization on October 17th, and I'll table that. This comment came only days after the same spokesperson said it didn't anticipate any problems with supply, and that's tabled as well. And in April, the Minister of Justice promised the NSLC was, and I quote, quite satisfied and comfortable, end of quote, that they have enough supply. We are about a week away, Mr. Speaker, from legalization, and it looks like this government's pot-selling plans are still in a haze. So, how does this government intend to manage a demand for legalized cannabis that far exceeds the supply it planned on?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Honourable Member for the question. As she would know, the national government has legalized cannabis, Mr. Speaker, across the country. She would also know the supply issue is not unique to Nova Scotia. It's we go across the province. We also, as you would know, there's a number of operations in Nova Scotia that have been permitted by Department of Health to be able to continue to grow this product. We look forward to them continuing to build their businesses, and the supply issue, Mr. Speaker, will be dealt with as we continue to roll out this new product that Nova Scotians will have access to in a legal way.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is what Nova Scotians know from past comments made by this government. This government was confident only a few short months ago that cannabis sales would put the books back in the black. The Minister of Finance declared that the tax revenue from recreational cannabis would ring in at over $20 million this fiscal year. That number was revised, though, down by $5.9 million as legalization July 1st went, of course, up in smoke. And now we have the provincial cannabis retailer casting doubt on its ability to secure supply for Nova Scotians. So, will the Premier admit that his estimates for cannabis tax revenue were never grounded in reality, and has he factored in the supply issue into these estimates?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for her question. I have all the confidence in the world, Mr. Speaker, in the budgets that we presented to this House, and so do Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We continue to operate in the fiscal reality of this great province of ours. The Minister of Finance, Chair of Treasury and Policy Board, continues to make objections, Mr. Speaker, to what projections to what she believes the revenue will be. We'll continue to work with that. She would also know the costs associated with this product will be borne by the taxpayers, whether it is an extra policing, whether it's an extra services that we require in terms of support to help them do their job on the street. All of those will be borne by the province, Mr. Speaker, and we still live by the statement, Mr. Speaker. We don't see this as a big revenue windfall for the province of Nova Scotia. We are meeting our obligation to ensure that this product, though, is administered in a safe way to the people of this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the problem is that the numbers keep changing. From the beginning, this government's Made in Nova Scotia approach to co-locate has been nothing but a fiasco. They were told not to co-locate alcohol and cannabis, and they decided to ignore that professional advice. They saw other provinces taking the lead on industry development and helping their municipalities while they remained idle. The result, Nova Scotia is behind the rest of this country when it comes to federally licensed producers. And now we're facing a cannabis shortage that will drive people right back to the illicit market, something this government said they didn't want to see happen. If this Liberal government is so inept at the administration of recreational cannabis, how inept will it be when it comes to enforcement?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member. She go back when the Minister of Finance stood in her place. Mr. Speaker, the national government had a position of July 1st. That was changed to October 17th. Mr. Speaker, any prudent government would then change what they believe the income would be. Anyone who actually manages any type of budget would meet, Mr. Speaker, and change based on new circumstances they would have. The Honourable Member should also know we have an obligation to make those adjustments to notify Nova Scotians based on the fact of the dates that have been changed by another level of government, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work and ensure that with this product, when it comes legalized on October 17th, that we're doing it in a safe way to administer to the people of this province. We'll continue, like all other Canadian jurisdictions, look for supply, and we'll continue to make sure that the product, Mr. Speaker, will be made available in a safe way to the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
The Premier continues to refer to the urgency of action as an argument in favour of redeveloping the hospital on a P3 model. We agree that the hospital replacement is an urgent matter, and that's why we brought forward the Jobs and Building Plan for Upgrades in Capital Health in 2011. The plan provided for the taking down of the Centennial Building and the completion by 2020 of the QE2. Dr. Drew Bethune, the Provincial Cancer Care Medical Director, who spoke at last week's announcement, spoke in favour of the plan in 2011, calling it a well-thought-out plan for buildings that meet our patients' needs while using our tax dollars wisely. And this plan was on the Premier's desk the moment that he came to office. Can the Premier explain why it took 5 full years for this government to bring forward a plan for the redevelopment of the QE2?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, because the plan did not meet the needs of Nova Scotians, and on top of that, Mr. Speaker, it's like everything else fiscal when it comes to the NDP, it was nowhere near reality.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier's arguments in favour of the P3 redevelopment of the QE2 are specious and spurious. It is simply not possible for a private company to develop the hospital as cheaply as the government can. A private company can't borrow money at interest rates that the government can. It'll be enormously expensive for us to mitigate the 30-year risks of a private sector healthcare firm, and there is a line in every P3 development for profit that doesn't exist in the contracts for any other building mode. And so why will the Premier then just not admit the plain fact that what the government has chosen as a mode for redeveloping our hospital is a more expensive option?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with the Honourable Member's question at all. Mr. Speaker, we continue to go through this process. I've laid out to him the challenges that we've been able to face with from neglect. Mr. Speaker, we have a physical piece of infrastructure that had been neglected by successive governments when it came to the investment required. So we took this opportunity to work with Nova Scotians to ensure that we continue to move forward, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we're providing services to Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other. Only the New Democrats, Mr. Speaker, will believe that we should continue to build what we currently have. The reality of it is the investments we're making in Dartmouth are positive investments for not only the citizens of the Dartmouth region, but those of us that live outside of it, Mr. Speaker. The investments that we're making, Mr. Speaker, in the Clayton Park, Bears Lake area, Mr. Speaker, is a positive investment. We continue to make sure. We're going to continue to make sure that we then do an investment at the HI site. Part of that will be done in our traditional build, but we also know, Mr. Speaker, that when we go through the proper way of scoping out, ensuring that we get the right plan in place. That's why we're taking the next 12 months, working with the healthcare providers to ensure that we have the right plan in place. We can do this project, Mr. Speaker, on time, on budget, and P3 model that Nova Scotian taxpayers will own, Mr. Speaker. At the end of this deal, we'll continue to put in our suite of infrastructure.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
A great range of voices weighed in on this debate when it was held 21 years ago in Nova Scotia, when the Liberals proposed to redevelop our schools, then our new schools, on a P3 basis. And one of the voices that was prominent in that debate was that of John Hamm. John Hamm said at the time that P3 ought to stand for pay the premium price. And he warned at the time that in 20 years when those leases expire, there's going to be a price to pay. And he was right. The leases expired after 20 years, and we had to pay $228 million in order to buy our own schools back. Mr. Speaker, what part of once bitten, twice shy does the Premier not understand?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question. Again, I want to go through the process, Mr. Speaker, the P3 model. We're looking forward to continuing to work with consortiums around the world, Mr. Speaker. We want to make investments to try to make sure that we get the right price for the taxpayers of this province. A part of this provision will be ensure that when this gets handed back to the ownership of the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, with the same condition as the day it's opened. And I want to go back to quoting a former Premier, Mr. Speaker. He didn't call me up and ask me to take back the P3 school. I was in Pictou County, I can tell you that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On September 11th, I asked the Minister for Advanced Education about sexual violence strategies on Nova Scotia campuses. He said each university must have a sexual violence strategy in place, and if they don't, there will be financial consequences. He didn't say what the penalty would be if universities fail to follow their sexual violence policy. Is it enough for the minister that our post-secondary institutions submit a plan to his office, or are there penalties for schools that don't comply with their own policies?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Department of LAE works very closely with all the universities in the province. As I did mention before, the penalties that are in place are the increases, and that's if the schools do not have a standalone sexual violence strategy. But what we also have been doing, Mr. Speaker, is as those strategies are put in place, we work together with the universities as we gain more experience, and we tweak them and we try to make them better for the students and to ensure the safety of all students on campus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
It is with sadness and frustration this weekend we read news stories about a young woman at St. Yves who reported a sexual assault, followed all the rules set out by the university and still felt unsafe at campus. The individual the university judged to be responsible for the assault continues to attend St. Yves. Meanwhile, the young woman, who was not told that her assailant would be returning to campus, felt it necessary that she had to transfer to another university. There seems to be no justice whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, in this situation. So I'd like to ask the Minister, is he satisfied with how St. Yves handled this situation? And if not, what is he going to do about it?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have spoken with St. Yves, Mr. Speaker, in terms of this case because I was very shocked to see it in the news, and I was disappointed, as all Nova Scotians would be. St. Yves did acknowledge that they did not put the victim first, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we do want. We want to put the victim first, we want to protect them, and we want them to come forward. So, Mr. Speaker, St. Yves has given an apology to the family. They've refunded all of the students' tuition and room and board and all expenses paid for the year. Mr. Speaker, I also asked the department to explore how can we expel students who are accused of sexual violence and who are going through a court process, and that's something we're looking into because the victims should feel safe coming forward, Mr. Speaker, and we also should have the victims not be at school and have the person who they're accusing be there as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. This week, there have been disturbing reminders in the news that sexual violence continues to be a major challenge on campuses in Nova Scotia. For many of us, it's a reminder of how disappointing and frustrating the minister's responses regarding sexual violence on campus has been. Student leaders in both opposition parties have called upon the minister to use his legislative powers to insist that universities do more, but the minister has deflected the criticisms and assured us that universities are doing enough. So my question to the minister is this: will he please reconsider his position and bring legislative changes to ensure that Nova Scotia campuses become safer for students, in particular for young women who are disproportionately victims of sexualized violence?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, if I thought that legislation alone would solve sexual violence on campuses or in our society, I would bring it forward. But, Mr. Speaker, we have legislation in place, the Criminal Code of Canada, and sexual violence still happens. What we did is we embarked on a process with all our universities, changing the culture on campus, urging victims to come forward, teaching what sexual violence is, what consent is. And, Mr. Speaker, I have committed to student groups, I'll commit to this House, that if this does not work, then I will lobby my government, and I'm sure my government will be very open to bringing legislative changes forward in terms of sexual violence on university campuses. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this recent case at St. Yves isn't the only one. I've actually spoken personally to a young sexual assault survivor who's attending Dalhousie University, who tells me that restorative justice is the route that most universities seem to be using. And she asks if that may be the cause of low reporting statistics, since her attacker only had to do a short online course and write a 10-page letter. She said it just wasn't enough, and he was definitely not banned from campus. So, Mr. Speaker, student advocates have said that they feel betrayed by this government, that the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students has called the minister's opposition to legislative changes what she calls, quote, liberal hypocrisy at its finest, and I will have to table that. So my question for the minister again is, why won't he just take legislative action to address sexual violence on campus, as students have been requesting and demanding for so long now?
Just before the minister answers the question, the honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River, the word hypocrisy is an unparliamentary term, even if it's within a quote of somebody else. So I'll ask you to stand up and retract that statement just before the minister answers. The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will retract it, although it was not my own words, but the students in writing in a newspaper article.
Appreciate that. Still unparliamentary. The honourable member for, the honourable minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we embarked on this journey in terms of addressing sexual violence on our campuses, one of the aspects of that was brought forward to us is that in the past, over 90% of sexual violent conduct is not even reported, and that's part of the culture we want to change. Mr. Speaker, if I thought legislation would actually stop sexual violence on campuses, I would be the first to bring it forward. We know that legislation doesn't solve all our problems, Mr. Speaker. If it did, then we'd bring the legislation forward, or it would have been solved a long time ago when sexual violence was made a criminal conduct. Mr. Speaker, what we have embarked on is working with our universities, our partners, to change the culture on campus, to raise awareness, and Mr. Speaker, it will work and it will make changes to the lives of Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the changes happening, and I have committed that if the changes don't happen, we will bring forward legislation. Thank you.
Honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Energy. Yesterday, the Irving refinery in St. John experienced what was described by company officials as a major incident. Fortunately, only minor injuries were reported, but it does raise concerns for Nova Scotians about gas prices, as the St. John refinery is a major supplier of gasoline for Nova Scotia and other jurisdictions in eastern Canada and northeastern U.S. It is unclear how long the refinery will be out of operations, but even a short-term shutdown could have an effect. Has the minister been briefed on the length of the shutdown, and should Nova Scotians expect a gasoline shortage?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. I have not had a full briefing yet on the incident, but I will say that my thoughts are with the families of the injured workers yesterday. I do expect a full briefing on it, and I don't expect any changes at this point. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, refinery capacity in North America is a delicate balance. We've seen price spikes here when capacity has been shut down in the Gulf of Mexico due to bad weather. This shutdown is in our own region, and the reshuffling of supplies could create shortfalls. And even if there aren't shortfalls, the reduction in supply could create a spike in gasoline prices. If past supply shortfalls are any indication, how much would Nova Scotians expect to pay for gasoline?
The Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, at this point now, my number one concern was with those families when the incident took place yesterday. We continue to work with our fuel suppliers, whether they're here locally in the province or across our region. We continue those conversations. Again, at this point, I don't have any additional information about any gas price changes. I do expect a full briefing of what took place yesterday, but first and foremost, our thoughts are with the families.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister for NSLC. Today we learned that the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation plans to require that anyone buying recreational cannabis online needs an access code beforehand. These access codes are not available online, but only in physical NSLC locations. This is a sudden, unexplained change from requiring a signature and a proof of age at the door when a shipment is delivered. We are just over a week away from legal recreational cannabis, and this government has demonstrated once again that it does not have a firm plan in place. My question for the minister, why suddenly announce this significant verification measure only days before legalization?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when we acknowledged that we would be asking NSLC to be responsible for the retail of cannabis, we did that recognizing that they are credible, they focus on social responsibility, they ensure the safety and the security of all of those people who are purchasing from them. We believe that they have the respect of Nova Scotians, that they are seen to be credible, and we believe that NSLC is the right avenue for the purchase of cannabis.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the beginning, this government has insisted it knows best when it comes to the sale and safety of recreational cannabis. It has ignored nearly all best practices and the warnings of experts from across our country. Now this government's plan to provide cannabis access codes raises the question of what kind of data they are collecting on Nova Scotians purchasing cannabis. Our provinces across the country are using industry-standard e-commerce platforms like Shopify that have been transparent about how personal data is being collected and stored. With all of this government's go-it-alone solutions for legal cannabis, how do we know that cannabis access codes won't end up like the FOIA portal?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The process that my colleague has identified, Mr. Speaker, is actually the last of the process that we have implemented to respond to the federal legalization of cannabis. The process that my colleague has referred to and the use of the barcode, Mr. Speaker, actually retains little to no data, Mr. Speaker, that is not already retained. There is no new additional data provided by Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We believe this model will be seen as the example in the country. We believe this model will best protect our youth, Mr. Speaker, on the front end of the retail model as well as the back end, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, recently situations at nursing homes in Cape Breton were brought to my attention. According to what I've heard, there are staffing shortages in these nursing homes that have reached a critical point. Some patients are only taken out of bed every other day because there isn't sufficient staff or equipment to get residents up every day. It's greatly concerning to me that there are elderly Nova Scotians who are needlessly confined to their beds because of undue shortages. So my question to the Minister, is he aware of this day-on, day-off practice of patient care, and how widespread is it in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member raises a point with respect to quality of care in our long-term care facilities. It's a perspective that government, and all of government shares. So I believe all members of the legislature do. That's why earlier this last month in September, announced a panel of experts who have come together to evaluate and come forward with some evidence-based recommendations on what steps we can take to improve the quality of care in nursing home facilities across the province.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was told that the facilities in question have clean records when it comes to pressure sores. This was their defence for the practice. Since they don't have a history of pressure sores, there's nothing to worry about. But, Mr. Speaker, that's like saying because I haven't had any accidents, I could probably drive with my eyes closed. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health is expecting this report on pressure sores from his expert panel, as he just said. So will the Minister of Health be as quick to implement any recommendations on the pressure sores as the Minister of Education was to implement the Glaze report, or will he simply take it under advisement?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to clarify for the members of the legislature that this expert panel's scope of review goes well beyond the limited focus of pressure sores. Mr. Speaker, that's one area that they'll certainly be looking into, but in fact, we've actually taken action already this summer in that area. We established some people with expertise. We went out, provided support in our facilities to help with assessments, reassessments, some education initiatives. We provided additional resources in terms of material, but also equipment to help our long-term care facilities. We continue to work in that area to improve the efficiency of providing the supports requested in those facilities with pressure injuries. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. For over a month now, I've been asking the minister to respond to a lack of proper treatment available for victims of sexual assault at the Colchester East Hants Health Centre in Truro. Government has been slow to respond, I have to say, but one of my constituents, whose story had been published in media reports, emailed the minister personally to share her experience. And last Thursday, October 4th, she received a response from the minister saying that the Premier has now committed to having sane services available in Truro. While this is very welcome news, Mr. Speaker, can the minister please tell us when we can expect to have sane services in Truro?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member bringing the question forward. I don't have a specific time frame. I did get an update last week. I've requested another one. I believe we're getting some additional information from the Health Authority today, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the discussions about what and how to implement and move forward to ensure services are made available as soon as possible. It's important for members to realize that the care and the services being provided does require specialized training, so you need to have the staff, the nurses available and lined up to provide the training. So again, as I said, Mr. Speaker, meetings have been ongoing to work with potential service providers to line up how this process and how the services will be rolled out in that community. The
honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre sent a question and a request over a year ago now and heard nothing back from the Health Authority. Then they resent it about a month ago. They still heard nothing. And now we're hearing that things are starting to happen. We also know that there are nurses lined up ready who want to take the training. So we're set to go. Truro is ready. Having sane services in communities across the province is clearly a step in the right direction, but obviously the minister can understand that a timeline is essential. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister assure us that sane services will be available in Truro before the end of this year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, indeed, work is ongoing. The proposal that was first brought forward last year was a proposal to provide weekend coverage, Mr. Speaker. If we wanted to roll out with just weekend services, Mr. Speaker, we perhaps could have adopted that. But we're continuing our work, Mr. Speaker, with the potential service providers to just work out those details and ensure we get the path forward. What I can assure the member, Mr. Speaker, and all members here, and indeed all residents of the region, that we'll get this program rolled out to the community as soon as practically feasible and possible.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Fisheries. Fishing is the lifeblood of our economy, especially in Argyll-Barrington, as I'm sure it is in many areas of our province. Hundreds of millions of dollars of fresh seafood, lobster, haddock, halibut and crab, just to name a few. Many of our ports and wharves are now too small or in some cases unsafe to use. I know this is a federal issue, but how will the Minister of Fisheries ensure that these important pieces of infrastructure get the attention that they so sorely need?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much for the very important question. This is indeed an ongoing problem with our fishing industry in the province, and it does fall under small crafts and harbours federally. Your colleague had brought some stuff and information about a wharf in Cape Breton and a breakwater in Cape Breton, which we're following up with a letter to the federal minister responsible for that, and we'll continue to lobby on behalf of the fishermen of the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's something like 28 wharves from Cape Forshue around to Backrow. These are the business parks of our communities. They are too small for the size of vessels or inadequate for the weather that we're experiencing, especially during our lucrative lobster season. Wedgeport, East Pubnico, Stony Island, and I know many other members can list a bunch. I'm sure Soniaville's in there, and I'm sure a number of them as you go around the Digby Way. This can create some real risks for the safety of fishers and their equipment. Will the minister and this government truly lobby our federal government and make them realize that our fishery needs support and requires real investment to ensure the safety of all of our fishers?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Yes, again, thank you for this very important question. It is vital for our fishing community to have the resources they need in the form of breakwaters and wharves and all the facilities they have to put in place. And we have been lobbying, we will continue to lobby the federal government for proper funding to do this.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Krista Huskins is a mom who lives in Liverpool. She waited 18 months to secure an appointment for an autism diagnostic observation schedule for her daughter. Although this assessment has been completed, her daughter will now wait at least an additional 6 months to participate in the early intensive behavioral intervention assessment. By contrast, Dylan Meisner, who recently moved to Liverpool from New Brunswick, is the father of an autistic son. The entire process from ADOS to full participation in the EIBI program in St. John's was only 4 months. My question is, can the minister explain why Nova Scotia parents are forced to wait nearly 24 months for these crucial assessments for autistic children?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for raising this question. Indeed, we do recognize the value and the importance of early intervention for youth, Mr. Speaker. That's why we continue to invest both through our investments towards mental health initiatives, the education department, Mr. Speaker, investments there as well. As far as the difference between the Nova Scotia and the New Brunswick, I'm not aware of differences in the structure, but I'll certainly take a look to see if they've got something set up in St. John that's different. But Mr. Speaker, it could be just the circumstances of the demand at that particular point in time as well.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his response. Mr. Meisner believes had his son been born in Nova Scotia instead of New Brunswick, he would be experiencing the same struggles as Ms. Huskins and thousands of other Nova Scotia families who have an autistic child. Autism Nova Scotia has highlighted that psychologists are the only professionals permitted to perform ADOS assessments in Nova Scotia. The cost for the ADOS assessments can run as high as $3,000, leaving parents to face both delays and excessive financial costs. My question to the minister is, what steps is the minister taking to address the need for additional professionals who can administer the ADOS tests and resolve this immense backlog?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Nova Scotia Health Authority continues to perform recruitment, as they have the responsibility through legislation to provide the operational services in our healthcare system between the IWK and the Nova Scotia Health Authority, our two health authorities, Mr. Speaker. They provide the operational services. It's through those entities, Mr. Speaker, that the recruitment of healthcare professionals takes place. They continue with their efforts, Mr. Speaker. We as a province work with them to provide incentive programs and initiatives to help support the recruitment efforts.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Environment. For 10 years, people who live near Noonan's Provincial Beach in Eastern Passage have been contacting various government departments about the erosion on their beach. In the last decade, residents have not received a satisfactory answer from any level of government, and the issue has never been addressed. So they formed an organization. Most recently, I contacted the Minister's office on behalf of the organization on September the 10th. I was told in a response from the department that they would address the erosion problem in about 2 weeks. The residents are still waiting, so I'm just asking the minister, when can the residents expect a response from the minister, and when will corrective action be taken at Noonan's Beach?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to admit to the honourable member, I haven't seen that correspondence chat. When I do see it, we will make sure that the information gets out to her as well and lets her know. We know that beaches and erosion are a big problem around the province. That's why we're talking about our Coastal Strategy Act, so that there is continuity with all the municipalities in how they deal with their coastal properties. And formerly in DNR, it was also an issue that we were dealing with the breakwater. So it is a continuing issue. Certainly need to find a solution for it, and I thank the member for the question. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for her answer. Of course, as she just mentioned, erosion of our provincial shoreline continues to be an ongoing challenge. It has a real impact, though, on the people in my community and their property. For instance, one of the constituents who's part of this group lives across the street from the beach. During a last windstorm in January 2018, she ended up with sand and seaweed in her basement. The road was also torn up, and this affects both resale value and getting in and out of their community. The damage was so extensive to the road that the municipality had to repair the roads, putting the cost from the province's lack of action on their community beaches onto the municipality. So the question to the minister is, would the minister commit to visiting Eastern Passage to tour the area and to meet with concerned Noonan Beach area residents about what a potential plan of action would be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to answer or to discuss the situation again with the flooding. This is not unique to Eastern Passage. It's not unique to any area of Nova Scotia. We're finding the same thing happening on the eastern shore and the south shore. It's happening in Cape Breton. It's happening in Halifax here, where we've seen different weather patterns bring water and debris right into the city. So it's something that's happening all across Canada, or all across Nova Scotia, and we're going to be working with the municipalities to improve things in the future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Lands and Forestry. 12 organizations representing over 2,000 private woodlot owners have endorsed the implementation of the Leahy recommendation, saying it will be good for the forest sector. Private woodlot owners highlight that, quote, they are hampered by insufficient markets to support the economic feasibility of carrying out forest improvement work. The Leahy report includes specific recommendations for government to support the creation of local markets for forest products that will help us to move towards ecological forestry. So my question for the minister is, will he commit that his government will help expand local wood markets to support ecological forestry?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question and for her interest and support for government's endeavour to look at the forestry industry with the Leahy report and move towards a more ecological-based system. The report has 45 recommendations. Staff continues to go through each one assiduously, and we also meet with our stakeholders. Met with actually the industrial private woodlot owners already. I continue to meet with others. There are opportunities that we can look at. I look forward to continuing those discussions, and we'll move forward when we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, the Leahy report puts special emphasis on the potential of small-scale wood energy projects. Done right, small-scale heating with wood can provide highly efficient, sustainable local heating source that can replace oil consumption in schools and municipal buildings. The experience of Summerside PEI shows what can be accomplished. There is interest from municipalities here in Nova Scotia, like Bridgewater. If some government buildings adopt wood heating systems, it would provide a local, appropriately scaled and flexible market for low-value wood to help make more ecological harvest possible. So my question for the minister is, will he work with woodlot owner associations and municipalities to develop a program for using wood for heat in government buildings?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. Again, this is one of the 45 recommendations that that we've already begun to look at. Even before the Leahy report came out, we've had discussions internally. The member from Clare Digby as well as the Minister of Finance have brought this to my attention, so it is one that I think is a good opportunity, particularly for areas where there's pulpwood and other low-value wood that doesn't have access to markets such as the pulp mills. But indeed, it is an opportunity that if it works, we'll look at the costs and we'll look at different sites and see if we can accommodate it through the tendering process with our departments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the town of Port Hawkesbury is partnering with the province in the Destination Reeve Street pilot project. This project is multi-layered, with one aspect aiming to reduce 4 lanes to 3 along the town thoroughfare using the road diet concept with space devoted to active transportation. While I admire the intent and certainly welcome beautification and active transportation, I worry about the safety and potential negative impacts of these changes. Reeve Street is a busy street for commercial activity because Reeve Street is part of the busy 100 series highway. Despite assurances of safety, my constituents question the wisdom of building bike lanes next to large transport truck traffic. Mr. Speaker, why is the province reducing lanes to install active transportation routes on a 100 series highway?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. I want to congratulate the town of Port Hawkesbury in particular for stepping forward and looking to improve their community by taking the industrial nature of Reeve Street and transforming it into an active transportation corridor which will complement all the citizens of Port Hawkesbury and in particular and all the users. From our perspective, of course, we're interested primarily in safety. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the minister who seemed a bit surprised by my question. I just want to make sure he understands that Reeve Street is in fact part of the 100 series highway. The concerns of my constituents over this project go beyond the obvious safety issues. While consultation was held with the community of Port Hawkesbury, no consultation was extended into the other communities in Cape Breton-Richmond. A road diet initiative on this section of highway will impact local traffic and traffic using it as a highway, because it is a highway, the only highway access into the rest of Cape Breton-Richmond. This could have serious impacts on communities further down the line. Will the minister commit to put the road diet aspect of this project on hold until TIR consultations with other communities and business owners in Cape Breton-Richmond occur? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my apologies. The previous statement wasn't addressed to any minister, so I thought maybe one of my colleagues might like to take it. In any case, the matter has gotten wide.
Please, the Honourable Minister of Transportation.
The matter has gotten wide consultation in the community. There's been a lot of the greater community. There's been a lot of public meetings. I've received tremendous support for this particular project from people who are outside of the town itself. At the end of the day, this is a project being put forward by the town, and in the absence of any change in their direction, we continue to support what they're planning on doing, which is a big upgrade for that particular section of road. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker, I bet everyone on the government side is paying attention now. Mr. Speaker, in the spring, I asked the Minister of Health for more details about which Dartmouth practices were receiving the nurse practitioners announced by the Minister in March. The Minister indicated he'd get back to me on the locations of those practices, but now it's October, and I'd like to be able to tell my constituents the locations. I don't have to remind the Minister, I hope, of the significant pressures Dartmouth is facing from the doctor shortage impacting our province. I will remind the Minister that my constituents are anxious to know when and where they can access resources promised by the government. My question is this: can the Minister confirm where the nurse practitioners announced for Dartmouth 7 months ago have been placed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and timely that the member raises this question. In fact, We've been reviewing the information over this week to identify exactly where, not just in Dartmouth, but across the province, and the status of those. So, Mr. Speaker, I can advise the member that not just his community, but other communities will be getting an update in the very near future.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for that response, and I look forward to finding out the information regarding those locations. As the minister would know, Mr. Speaker, as he would know from our exchanges in the spring, 40% of the family doctors in Dartmouth will be retiring over the next 5 years. And the minister and this government, Mr. Speaker, have encouraged Nova Scotians without a family doctor to add themselves to the Need a Family Practice wait list. But the number of individuals on that list in the central zone is closing in on 30,000. Residents of Dartmouth are discouraged to see this number grow month after month. My question is this: can the minister tell the people of Dartmouth the net impact of these new nurse practitioners in terms of new patients, particularly when every week we hear of another doctor retiring or leaving? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, can assure the member that these collaborative practices, as well as the supports that government provides to practitioners through family practice nurses, nurse practitioners, and other healthcare professionals like social workers, therapists, physical therapists, and occupational therapists, Mr. Speaker. It's the groups that come forward to request and work with the Nova Scotia Health Authority to identify what composition makes the most sense. The impact and the effect, Mr. Speaker, varies from practice to practice because indeed the complements do vary depending on the teams that are pulled together. But I assure the member that I've been to practices across the province, including in Dartmouth, and they speak very positively about the impacts of their ability to perform more services for the good people of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, local family physicians and internists have shared their frustration with me about our pharmacare program. Mr. Speaker, family physicians do a minimum of 10 years of post-secondary education, and internists do a minimum of 14 years of post-secondary education. Yet when they prescribe a medication to best treat a patient, an employee who is not a doctor at Medivive Blue Cross will often deny a patient the medication their doctor has ordered. My question to the Minister of Health is he willing to examine this practice and seek to stop it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member may be aware, in the province, as with other provinces and territories across the country, we do have pharmacare programs. Indeed, the list of medications that would be approved that fall within that list are actually, in the last number of years, being informed by clinical research done on a pan-Canadian level. That advice comes forward to help identify what drugs provinces are likely to adopt, and that information, Mr. Speaker, is not made really at the bureaucratic level, Mr. Speaker, but indeed with clinical research done at a national level.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is the only province that has not approved a certain diabetic medication, even though this organization that he's pointed to has recommended it. One of the most common chronic conditions that medications are prescribed for and then denied is diabetes. Last week, one of my constituents who did not have access to diabetic medication, sadly, had to have urgent surgery to have a limb amputated. Instead of focusing on the lower costs of prevention and medical management, this government is now covering the costs of hospitalization and surgery. But most importantly, a man is dealing with the loss of his limb. Question to the minister, is he willing to look at the overall costs of diabetes, commit to a diabetes strategy that focuses on prevention and management, and stop pharmacare from preventing doctors from having optimal medical management?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the member that indeed the process for the members' benefit, indeed all of the members that goes through, there are actually about 3 or 4 steps that pharmaceutical products go through in jurisdictions across the country. The first is Health Canada, which essentially does an approval to ensure that the product doesn't cause harm. Then there's the scientific review that CADA, the Pan-Canadian Assessment, does to verify if there's an efficacy or value in that the product works and provides value beyond existing products. Then, Mr. Speaker, we've entered into negotiations on a pan-Canadian level as well to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. And then finally, after all those steps are done, moves into the provincial jurisdiction to add to our formulary. I have been working, Mr. Speaker, and continue within the department to improve our response rate once drugs get to that level.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Last week, Halifax Regional Council decided to allocate up to $500,000 from property taxes to fund the Halifax Hospice. But before voting, councillors expressed concerns that they were being forced to take on a provincial responsibility. Is the Minister of Municipal Affairs concerned that municipalities are bearing the financial burden of healthcare services that the province is failing to fund adequately?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, each and every municipality across Nova Scotia and their respective councils have the ability to make decisions that they best see to serve their constituents. We count on them to do so, and we support them as they do make those decisions, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be there to support them right along as time flies by here, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move